We three kings of Israel. Saul, David, and Solomon. We are still in the life of David as he is pursued by Saul. And what we're going to do is run with David as he runs from Saul, because we're going to go pretty quickly through a few chapters here in 1 Samuel. We'll start in 1 Samuel chapter 21. What we just saw was that David had gone to the priest at Nob, and came to Ahimelech the priest. We're going to hear more about him in a bit. But he came there and he took the bread that really wasn't lawful for him to take. And we remember Jesus calling back to this as he was calling out the Pharisees and saying that he was Lord of the Sabbath. It wasn't right what David had did, what David had did. It's good grammar. Don't worry about it. It wasn't right what David had done, but the Pharisees had still elevated David in their eyes, probably to a status that they shouldn't have, and he wanted them to elevate him as Lord of the Sabbath. Instead, we're picking up in verse 10, 1 Samuel chapter 21. And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And remember, he had taken the sword of Goliath, right? So that's pretty much all he had on him. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. They heard about it there, right? And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And so he changed his behavior before them. Why he was afraid, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe he thought they were going to kill him, thinking that he was the king. At any rate, he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Look, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So he's basically saying, okay, I've got enough madmen in this country, right? I don't need more. Take him away. So in chapter 22, we see that David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. One interesting thing to note before we move on too far is that even Achish, he recognized that David was king. Saul wasn't willing to recognize it yet. Even if he knew it, he wasn't really willing to recognize it yet. But we do see that Achish had recognized, a foreign king, right? Had recognized David was king of Israel. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. So there's no small amount of men here with David at this point. Maybe small in comparison to Israel's entire army, but no small amount of men. And David went from there to Mizpeh of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And the prophet Gad said to David, Do not remain in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. So even the king of Moab was more willing to take David's family in than Saul, the king of Israel at the time. Now here's a hard story to hear, but verse 6 of chapter 22, 1 Samuel. Now Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Saul was ready to engage, right? And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, Hear now, people of Benjamin. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? Still self-centered. No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Man, when we make a habit of complaining about things, it can take us to some very terrible places, especially if we have the means, such as Saul did, who was the king over Israel, and he had the means to act out because of his complaints. Most of us don't really have the means to do the things that he did. He had the means to act out because of his complaints. Verse 9, then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Doeg was there, remember? It made mention of that. Verse 11, then the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. I want to mention something really quickly here that's very important. Ahitub was mentioned before. He's been mentioned earlier. Let me see here. 1 Samuel chapter 14. We'll go there really quickly. This is when Jonathan took his young man, the armor bearer, and they went and they defeated Philistines, right? And Saul, verse 2 of chapter 14, was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, verse 3, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh. Do you remember what God had told Eli was going to happen to his household, his lineage, because he would not deal with his lineage? He wouldn't deal with his sons and the corruption that they had as they were serving as priests. He said, there will come a time when there will not be an old man left in your house. That's foreshadowing. And so Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. This is Ahimelech listening to Saul. And Saul said to him, verse 13 of 1 Samuel chapter 22, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as at this day? I don't remember there being anything about him inquiring of God for him, but maybe he did. We won't say any more than that. Then Ahimelech answered the king, and who among all your servants is so faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law? Remember, David was married to Saul's daughter, and captain over your bodyguard, and honored in your house. Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? So it sounds like he did, right? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little. He's saying, look, this has been happening. What is so different now? And the only thing that's really different is the way that Saul is looking at it. He's figured out that Jonathan is protecting David, and he's looking at things differently, and now he's just out for blood from whomever he can get it from if he can't get it from David. So the only thing that's changed is Saul's outlook on it, Saul's perspective. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. There was a promise made to Eli, remember. Not a promise of good, but a promise nonetheless. Verse 17, and the king said to the guard who stood about him, turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servant, and remember, David lied to them. Maybe they saw through it, maybe they didn't see through it, but David lied to them, and it's not like they necessarily knew that David had fled, but Saul wasn't hearing any of it. He had made up his mind, right? I mean, if Jonathan, his own son, kept things from him, then of course everyone's keeping things from him, right? We can do that, can't we? We can go off the deep end in our own minds toward those things. So, the servants of the king, though, would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. The servants of the king seemed to even know better, and they weren't willing to put out their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And now in verse 18, then the king said to Doeg, you turn and strike the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests. And he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword both man and woman, child, and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. Remember when Saul would not obey God, would not utterly destroy, it was the Amalekites, would not utterly destroy them, but even took the king, he took the best, or at least let the people take the best of the sheep and the oxen and everything. No, but here, not only does he kill man, woman, and child, but ox, donkey, and sheep he puts to the sword. He does a better job of clearing out his own city of the priests of God than the enemy that God told him to clear out. This is how far Saul has come. This is how much he's let that hating spirit take over him, right? So he wouldn't listen. And even though the servants would not kill the priest, Doeg, that wonderful man, probably trying to find favor in King Saul, strikes everybody in the city. Verse 20, but one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord, and David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. And he was right. And remember, he lied about it to the priests. He didn't have to go to the priest. He could have gone elsewhere and trusted God to provide for him, but he went probably where he shouldn't have, and death followed. Verse 23, stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me, you will be in safekeeping. Remember, he had 400 men. He was amassing a little bit of a following here to be able to work with. Now we look in chapter 23. They told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Verse 2, therefore David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. Go, do it. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Trusting. He went, he trusted God. God gave him the victory. Verse 6, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David at Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. It was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. And Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. He destroyed Nob on the account of David, right? What would be different about Keilah? Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Verse 13, then David and his men, who were about 600, so 600 now, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. God did not give him into his hand. God was protecting David at this time, no matter how much Saul was seeking him. And we see that Saul continues to pursue him and does not relent. 1 Samuel 23, chapter 23, verse 15. Excuse me. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. Saul, my father, also knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. So Jonathan, again, he's still protecting David. And he says, don't fear. Look, you're going to be king, and I'll be next to you. He's not saying, I'm going to be king too. I'm going to rule with you. He's just saying, I'll be next to you. I'll be right there with you. Most likely a counselor, something along those lines. Verse 19, then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is south of Jeshimon? So, excuse me, the Ziphites, they weren't going to wait. They weren't waiting for Saul to come and pursue. They heard what happened at Nob. They knew what was going on, and they said, you know what, we'll just come and we'll tell him. So verse 20, they say, now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part will be to surrender him into the king's hand. And Saul said, may you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Again. He's looking at himself. Verse 22, he says, go, make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him, therefore it is told me that he is very cunning. Just told him, he's seen it, right? Verse 23, see therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information, then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah. And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon, and Saul and his men went to seek him, and David was told, so he went to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. When Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. Okay? Mountains, if you've ever seen the terrain out there, mountains aren't like the foothills around the Appalachians or on, all the East Coast mountains going up and down the East Coast of the United States. They aren't really even like mountains if you've gone out to the Rockies, if you've gone out anywhere in the West area. This is pretty arid and dry area, and a mountain will just kind of be a rock outcropping, but it'll be huge. It'll be gigantic, so it's very possible to be on one side of it and somebody else be on the other side, but there's no like foothills going along it, so you can walk alongside the mountains. This may have been kind of the terrain that they were at. It may not have been. It doesn't really define it here, but it does say they were on one side of the mountain, David and his men on the other side. And we see that David was hurrying to get away from Saul as Saul and his men were closing in on David. This is verse 26. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul returned from pursuing after David went against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape, and David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Something interesting to note. There's two things that we've seen so far. We've seen God work through man's sinfulness, even use it to accomplish his purpose. That's incredible to me. I mean, there's no doubt about the sovereignty of God, that he can use man's sinfulness to accomplish his purposes. We see that here. The Philistines are attacking the Israelites, and God is using that to pull Saul away from David, for David to escape, for David to live, for David to eventually become king as God wants, as he wishes, as he wills. But we also see it with the priests and with that hard to read passage of the slaughter of the priests at Nob. But that was part of Eli's house and Eli's lineage, which God said, there will come a day when you will not have an old man in your house. And that slaughter was part of that accomplishment, even working through, even with Saul's sin, and despite of, in a lot of ways. It's incredible to me, the sovereignty of God in all of these different ways, the way that he makes sure his purposes are accomplished. Now we move into chapter 24, and like I said, we're running through this stuff, right? We're running through pretty quickly here. So like I should do most of the time, I'm just going to let Scripture do most of the talking through all of this, but we're going to get through chapter 24, and we'll end on that this time. Chapter 24, verse 1 of 1 Samuel. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, 3,000 against 600 at this point, right, of David's men. So he takes 3,000 and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. You got to do what you got to do, right? Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, and the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you will do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterwards David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." Imagine saying that about someone who is pursuing you, trying to kill you. Someone who is willing to slaughter an entire city in order to kill you. To call him your Lord and the Lord's anointed. This is an incredible thing. This shows that David is a man after God's own heart. Despite the things we've seen already with the lying, with the deception, the things that we've seen gone on in David's life, and the things that we will see go on in David's life, this is why, it's an example of why God can say that David was a man after his own heart. Verse 7, so David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. Wow. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand?" Calls him his father. Remember, he is the king's son-in-law, right? "For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand will not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness." Impressive proverb. "But my hand will not be against you." Verse 14, "After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." He leaves it in the Lord's hands. Verse 16, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Soft answer turns away wrath, right? My word, did it do that here. Verse 17, he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil." Good job, Saul. Way to actually recognize what you're doing. "And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now, behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. He still wasn't quite willing to follow Saul at this point, right? "And now, behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand." So Saul acknowledges this, finally. Even if he knew it beforehand, he's acknowledging it, at least to someone else, to David specifically at this point, right? But that doesn't stop him from doing the things that he has been doing. You know, it doesn't always stop us. Acknowledging the truth acknowledging what's right, even believing it, holding on to it. This is part of what I had said earlier, right? Faith won't completely stop us from sinning. We're not going to get rid of that until God completely judges sin and wipes it away from the face of the earth, when the new heavens and the new earth are joined together and sin is gone. Until that day, we still have sin to contend with. However, all sin is a lack of faith. That's at the root of all sin, is a lack of faith. We're going to have times where that faith dwindles, dissipates, we lose our focus. And what is the promise that God has made us in those situations? If we confess our sin, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. We can see His faithfulness. We know that pretty easily. How is He just to forgive us our sins? It goes back to the fact that it's already been paid for. When Christ died, He died for all sin, past, present, future. We confess our sins. He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Praise be to God. One more verse, chapter 25, 1 Samuel. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him. Remember, he was the judge and leader for a long time. And they buried him in his house at Ramah. We're going to end it on that happy note, because that's going to come up later. More literally than you might expect. We'll see you next time.